Chapter 32. The next morning, Leonardo was awakened by the glaring sunlight streaming through the window. Awake? Before he could fully recover from his grogginess, a familiar voice, tinged with a subtle hint of affection, suddenly resonated by his ear. Instantly, the remnants of sleep vanished, and Leonardo abruptly opened his eyes to see a smiling face looking back at him. He stared in shock for a full 3 seconds before snapping upright in bed, his gaze fixed on Eloise, who was sitting by the bedside. He instinctively clutched the blanket tighter over himself, his face a mask of disbelief. The just-awakened man was much cuter than his usual stoic self, his hair slightly disheveled with a few strands stubbornly sticking up. Wearing a loose short-sleeved shirt with a large neckline that had slipped to one side due to his sleeping position, his distinct collarbones were exposed, and a small, pale mole seemed to sparkle under the sunlight, making one feel a tickle in their heart. It was clear that the man was extremely lacking in security, as his hand had been tightly clasped in his throughout the night. Leonardo had indeed been deeply asleep, but whenever she had moved, he would instinctively furrow his brow, leaving her with no choice but to let him hold her hand for most of the night. The bed in the room was large enough to comfortably accommodate 2 people. Eloise was not the kind of person to take advantage of others when they were vulnerable, and sharing a bed with a man and a woman at night did not stir any improper thoughts. Moreover, she had been preoccupied with Leonardo's troublesome matters all night, leaving no room for other thoughts. Seeing the man's panicked expression as he looked down at himself and realized he was still dressed in his casual outfit, he then sighed in relief with exaggerated reactions, causing Eloise to twitch her lips in response. Eloise, what kind of person does he think she is? Does he really believe she has no morals? Wake up and get ready quickly. We have a 9:30 flight, and Jiang and the others are already waiting, Eloise said as she stood up from the bed, her expression as calm as ever, in stark contrast to the still confused man on the bed. There was an odd sense of being used and then being ready to be abandoned at any moment. Leonardo's face was tense as he tried to calm his emotions, his mind recalling details from the previous night after entering the room. He remembered initially sitting beside Eloise as she slept, but eventually he grew sleepy himself. Although reason told him it was time to leave, his lingering affection kept him from doing so, and before he knew it, he had spent the entire night there. After ensuring nothing inappropriate had happened between them, Leonardo calmed down slightly, then remembered what Eloise had just said, causing his heart to skip a beat. Quickly getting out of bed, Leonardo picked up his phone from the bedside and glanced at the time displayed on the screen, causing a wave of sweat to break out on his back. "Did Jiang call?" Leonardo asked, turning his head. Eloise raised an eyebrow and casually replied, "Yes, I said you were still asleep." Leonardo. Now he was in deep trouble and couldn't explain himself even if he jumped into the Yellow River. At the airport waiting hall, Leonardo stood beside Jiang with a silent demeanor, the atmosphere becoming somewhat awkward. Eloise and Jim were conversing in the distance, and seeing this, Jiang could no longer flatter them with talented scholars and beautiful ladies. They had originally planned to gather at 8:30 in the hotel lobby, but when it was 8:29, Jiang hadn't seen Leonardo, so under Jim's intimidating gaze, he dialed Leonardo's number, only to have Eloise answer. Not only did it raise questions why Eloise had answered Leonardo's call, but the implication of "he's still asleep" was quite rich. Jiang stood frozen on the spot, while Jim appeared much calmer. It was then that Jiang realized he had been mistaken. Just a few days ago, he had been praising how well-suited Eloise and Jim were for each other in front of Leonardo, but it turned out the real, main character was right beside him. This was quite a big misunderstanding. His mood had become extremely complicated since that phone call, and now, being alone with Leonardo the assistant, he felt somewhat at a loss. Leonardo's face remained cold, much like usual, yet the slightly furrowed brow and tightly pressed lips revealed his internal turmoil. After an unknown length of time, Leonardo took the initiative to break the eerie silence. "Please don't misunderstand, Chief Jiang." Jiang paused briefly, his mind racing for a few seconds. Then he chuckled and replied in a teasing tone, "Don't worry, Assistant Leonardo, my lips are sealed." "I understand, just the youthful romance." At this, Leonardo's face darkened, a hint of irritation in his eyes, feeling the urge to curse. A few seconds later, the man finally gave up struggling, standing silently on the spot, glaring harshly at the culprit in the distance. Meanwhile, Eloise was unaware of her little boyfriend's new bout of temper. She was currently discussing matters concerning her parents with Jim. Last night, Niev had suddenly called Jim, seemingly wanting to extract some information about Eloise's love life. Jim couldn't understand his parents' thoughts. Previously indifferent to Eloise's relationships, they now seemed to watch closely, constantly worried she might lose interest in marriage or bring home a random celebrity. Since their last disagreement, Niev didn't dare to ask Eloise directly, so she turned to Jim, hoping to extract some information from him. However, Jim was shrewd. After realizing Niev knew nothing about Leonardo, he employed evasive tactics during their half-hour conversation, not revealing a single piece of information. Jim had intended to inform her last night, but both calls were rejected by Eloise, so it dragged on until now. Initially, Jim hadn't thought much of it, merely assuming Eloise was busy with work matters, but now it seemed it was more than just work. "How was your night?" Jim asked, his tone laden with teasing. Eloise, catching the subtext in his words, merely rolled her eyes and explained, "Don't overthink it. Nothing happened." Jim raised an eyebrow, knowing Eloise wasn't lying, so he didn't press further. "What are you going to do about your mother? You're not planning to tell them about Leonardo." "What am I supposed to say? I haven't even caught him yet." Jim's eyes flashed with surprise, finding it incredible that she still hadn't won over Leonardo. "Are you even trying?" Jim said, his gaze towards Eloise filled with suspicion. Eloise's face darkened as she elbowed Jim sharply, then shifted the topic. "Next time my mom calls you about this, just tell her I have someone I like. No need to mention names, just give a few compliments." "Planning the groundwork for meeting the parents?" Eloise didn't respond, but the look in her eyes seemed to say, "Or what?" Jim couldn't help but chuckle, his gaze inadvertently drifting towards Leonardo, feeling somewhat nostalgic. It was unexpected that someone like Eloise could take things so seriously for someone. On the plane, as expected, Eloise and Leonardo were seated next to each other. Not long after takeoff, Leonardo asked, "What were you talking about with Jim earlier?" Eloise glanced at the man beside her, his expression as usual, cold and composed, his eyes slightly lowered, his tone light, as if the question was just a casual one. At this, Eloise couldn't help but chuckle lightly, then leaned her head on his shoulder as naturally as before. "Nothing much, just asking me why I haven't caught you yet." This answer was unexpectedly blunt. Leonardo was stunned for 2 seconds, then pursed his lips slightly, rebutting softly, "Liar. What would I gain by lying to you?" Eloise said, glancing up slightly and fixing her gaze on his slightly reddened earlobes. "If you don't believe me, you can just ask him yourself after we land." Within seconds of finishing her sentence, Eloise continued, "So when are you going to give your consent?" The man didn't respond, only his ears grew redder. Eloise hadn't expected Leonardo to give her an immediate answer, so after making her statement, she went back to catching up on sleep, completely missing the deepening look in his eyes, which were like the calm surface of a dark sea at night, concealing surging undercurrents. After an unknown period, when the woman had fallen deeply asleep, the man finally spoke, his voice so soft it could only be heard by himself. "I'm sorry, just give me a little more time. Just a little." In the following 2 days after that, Eloise was caught up in a new wave of busyness. Although Eloise had handled many tasks before going to City Y, there were still piles of documents waiting for her at the company. Therefore, upon landing, she immediately entered overtime mode. Chasing after her younger boyfriend might have been thrilling, but the aftermath left a lot of mess to clean up. Eloise, when busy, was someone who isolated herself from the world. Leonardo, who hadn't received any news from Eloise since, once again fell into self-irritation. Knowing full well that, given Eloise's status, it was impossible for her to spend a lot of time on him, his twisted possessiveness couldn't help but want to claim all her time. Eloise was indeed busy, and Leonardo had a deep understanding of this after becoming Jim's assistant. His mind couldn't help but recall the scene from that night, when the woman gently embraced him and whispered in his ear, "She's tired." Concerned, he found it hard to concentrate on his work during the day. At 2 in the afternoon, the man finally couldn't hold back and sent a message. "Leonardo, is the company still busy lately?" 2 minutes later, the phone rang directly, making Leonardo's face fall as he swiftly walked to the staff lounge, ensuring no one was around before he answered the call. As soon as the call connected, the woman's playful voice came through the line. "Slacking off at work?" Leonardo was slightly taken aback, then denied it. No. In truth, he had indeed been distracted, not just once, and the culprit was teasing him over the phone. "The company is still busy. Focus on your work and stop overthinking, okay?" Eloise said, pointing out his little thoughts. Leonardo's face heated up, ready to rebut, but Eloise added from the other end of the phone, "I'll come find you for dinner tonight." His lips parted, and after a moment, his voice sounded in the quiet lounge. "Okay." Meanwhile, as soon as the call ended, the warmth on the woman's face vanished instantly, her brow returning to its usual cool expression. The warm air in the office suddenly dropped to a freezing point, making Luke beside her shudder involuntarily. "Any news?" "Yes," Luke replied, his nerves tightening as he entered a combat state, feeling even more tense than during the company's annual summary meeting. According to the private detective, the incident happened over a decade ago, and the people who lived near Leonardo's family have long since scattered, leaving few informed individuals. However, the incident involving Leonardo's family made a big splash back then, even making the social news at the time. Hearing this, Eloise's mood worsened, her brow furrowing with a hint of ruthlessness. "Get to the point." Luke swallowed hard, his back drenched in cold sweat, his skin taut. According to the information, Leonardo's parents fell in love during college. After graduation, Leonardo's father started from scratch and made a lot of money through years of hard work. When his mother was pregnant, his father secretly had an affair, often staying out all night under the guise of business trips. When Leonardo was 7, the mistress approached his mother intending to force a divorce. But after discovering the affair, his mother's mental state deteriorated significantly, leading to frequent quarrels. His mother couldn't bear the betrayal but didn't want a divorce. The situation escalated until it became common knowledge among the neighbors. Embarrassed by the scandal, Leonardo's father grew more determined to divorce and, unable to tolerate his wife's tantrums, moved in with his mistress, leaving only Leonardo and his mother in the house. Unfortunately, his mother developed severe depression and schizophrenia afterward, often beating Leonardo, who was still in elementary school. Sources from that time say Leonardo always bore injuries, old wounds healing only to be replaced by new ones. As a result, he had no friends and often walked alone at school. At this point, Luke couldn't help but glance at Eloise sitting at her desk, quickly withdrawing his gaze after a second, the words stuck in his throat, not daring to utter another sound. The air was suffocating with tension. Luke swore he had never seen Eloise with such a terrifying expression during his 2 years at the company. After a few seconds, Eloise's voice broke the silence in the office, the temperature around her dropping even further as she spoke. "Go on." Luke swallowed again, pressing on. According to the case investigation at the time, it was exactly 2 years since Leonardo's parents had separated. The testimony revealed that on that day, Leonardo's mother called her husband agreeing to a divorce, but upon his arrival, she lost control and stabbed him before turning the knife on herself. Both died on the spot, and Leonardo, then only 10 years old, witnessed the entire incident from the living room. Bang! The woman suddenly stood up from her chair, the noise from the chair's legs scraping against the floor piercing the quiet of the office, making everyone even more fearful. Next to the office was a floor-to-ceiling window design, and the high floor could overlook almost half the city. Eloise, when feeling irritable, would often stand by the window, looking down at the traffic and pedestrians below, her mood gradually calming. But now, Eloise's face was dark as she looked out the window, unable to quell the anger in her heart. She remembered that the first investigation had mentioned this incident. Back then, she had been furious, although she couldn't recall how angry she had been. It certainly wasn't even a tenth of her current anger. At that time, a few hasty words now seemed insufficient to describe the situation Leonardo had been in. It felt like a hand was tightly gripping her heart, not painful, but suffocatingly unbearable. Suddenly recalling the first time she met Leonardo, she had been captivated by him. Compared to his looks, the coldness and world-weariness he exuded had caught her eye more firmly. It was only now that she understood what kind of hellish experience had forged the aura that had attracted her attention. She rubbed her sore brow, feeling for the first time that she was also a detestable person. Continue. On the other side, Luke watched Eloise's back, his expression growing more solemn after a few seconds. After Leonardo's family's incident, all of Leonardo's parents' inheritance fell to Leonardo. After a struggle among the relatives, Leonardo eventually went to live with his grandparents. However, within 2 years of Leonardo being there, all the assets were squandered, mostly to support Leonardo's uncle, his mother's younger brother. But according to neighbors, Leonardo's life with his grandparents wasn't good. He had to take care of most of the chores in the old house, including cleaning and cooking. Although his grandparents didn't physically abuse him, their attitude towards him was harsh. Leonardo moved out of the old house after he turned 18 and enrolled in college. He excelled academically, earning a full scholarship, and supported himself through various provincial and national competitions and part-time jobs. After graduating from college, he joined a foreign enterprise, but just as he was about to become a full-time employee, he discovered that his supervisor was embezzling funds. After being fired, the supervisor turned things around on him, leaving Leonardo on many companies' blacklist. By now, it was clear why Leonardo, despite his achievements, hadn't landed a permanent job and had instead become a bartender, and why Jim had later hired him as his assistant. Eloise's brow remained furrowed as she silently gazed at the scenery outside the window. After a while, it seemed she thought of something and asked, "What about his parents' real estate?" Both of Leonardo's parents had passed away, leaving all their assets to him. It was easy to access some of the money in the bank, but the real estate under Leonardo's name was harder to claim. Hearing this, Luke's fingers flew over the tablet, quickly explaining, according to the investigation, Leonardo's parents owned 2 houses, both purchased after marriage. But when Leonardo was 9, the ownership of one house was secretly transferred to the mistress. The other house, where Leonardo's parents lived, is now occupied by his uncle's family. At this, Eloise's lips curved slightly, seeming to smile, but those who knew her knew it meant someone was about to get into serious trouble. Quite the feat, living in someone else's place for so long. I wonder if they have nightmares at night. Eloise turned her head and continued, "Where is the house that was given away now?" "It's still in the mistress's possession," Luke said, adding, "Eloise, the Miriam you asked me to investigate is the same mistress from over 10 years ago and, currently, the infidelity partner of Lu Jian." Eloise was slightly taken aback but quickly understood. The situation was dramatic, but when considered carefully it made sense. It wasn't hard to understand. When Miriam, as a mistress, went to confront Leonardo's mother, Leonardo probably witnessed it, which explained his strange reaction when he saw Miriam at the party, clearly recalling those darkest memories. A leopard can't change its spots, having an affair with a married man over a decade ago. To be someone's mistress now is not surprising. There's also a contact number for one of Leonardo's neighbors from back then, who still lives in the same place. The office fell silent again. A few minutes later, the woman turned around, picking up her phone and car keys from the desk, and walked towards the door. "Send me the contact number and address and any remaining documents to my email." Chapter 33. It was late afternoon, and the streets were relatively quiet with few passers-by. A red Porsche was parked on the roadside, its presence bold and eye-catching, drawing numerous glances from those who walked by. However, what truly caught people's attention was not the car, but the woman standing beside it. Wearing a chic yet simple Chanel-style outfit that accentuated her perfect body proportions, her long, slightly wavy black hair flowed down her back. A pair of black sunglasses perched on her nose, complementing her bright red lipstick, exuded an alluring charm that was hard to resist. Leaning casually against the car, her expression was cold and aloof, evoking admiration from those who passed by, yet no one dared to approach her, settling instead for furtive glances before discussing her with companions. At that moment, the door in front of Eloise suddenly opened, and an ordinary-looking man stepped out. His eyes met Eloise's, and he froze on the spot, completely dumbfounded for several seconds. "David?" Eloise removed her sunglasses, a subtle smile playing on her crimson lips, her eyes shining with confidence, drawing all attention. David reflexively responded with an "mm," his cheeks flushing as he stammered out his next words. "Excuse me, but who are you?" "I'm Eloise," she replied, standing upright and walking towards him. "I've come to ask you about something." As the woman approached, David felt an intense pressure, as if suddenly called to account by his boss. His back straightened, and he spoke with a cautious tone. Sure. What would you like to know?" Eloise's gaze fell on the garbage bag in his hand, and she raised an eyebrow before suggesting, "Shall we talk while we walk?" Her tone was polite, yet it compelled one to comply without question. By the time David realized it, he was already walking alongside Eloise. "Do you remember Leonardo, David? How was last night?" Jim asked, his tone teasing. Eloise caught the innuendo in his words and merely rolled her eyes before clarifying, "Don't get the wrong idea. Nothing happened." Jim raised an eyebrow, trusting her straightforwardness, and didn't push further. "What about your mother? Are you planning to tell her about Leonardo? What's there to say?" "I haven't even caught him yet," Eloise retorted. Jim was visibly surprised, finding it hard to believe she hadn't won over Leonardo yet. "Are you sure you're up to this?" he asked, eyeing her skeptically. Eloise's face darkened, and she playfully nudged Jim with her elbow before changing the subject. "Next time my mom calls you about this, just tell her I have someone I like. No names, just a little praise will do. Getting ready for meeting the parents, huh?" Eloise didn't respond, her look clearly stating what else. Jim couldn't help but chuckle, glancing instinctively towards Leonardo, feeling a touch of nostalgia. It was surprising to see someone as strong-willed as Eloise take such a serious approach for someone. On the plane, as expected, Eloise and Leonardo were seated next to each other. Shortly after takeoff, Leonardo inquired, "What were you and Jim discussing earlier?" Eloise glanced at the man beside her. His expression was as stoic as ever, his gaze lowered, his tone indifferent, as if the question was just a casual remark. At this, Eloise couldn't help but chuckle, then leaned her head on his shoulder as naturally as before. "Nothing much, just about how I haven't managed to win you over yet." This response was unexpected, and after a 2-second pause, Leonardo murmured a soft rebuttal, "Liar. Why would I lie to you?" Eloise retorted, looking up to catch sight of his reddening ears. "If you don't believe me, ask him yourself once we land." Moments later, she continued, "So, when will you agree?" The man remained silent, his ears turning even redder. Eloise hadn't expected an immediate answer from Leonardo. After voicing her question, she settled into rest, unaware of the deepening gaze of the man beside her, his eyes like the calm yet turbulent sea under the night sky. After an unknown period, when the woman had completely fallen asleep, the man finally spoke, his voice so low it was barely audible. "Sorry, just give me a little more time. Just a little." The following 2 days, Eloise was engulfed in a new wave of busyness. Despite having preemptively handled many tasks before heading to City Y, there were still piles of documents awaiting her at the office. Upon returning, Eloise immediately dove into overtime mode. Chasing after her boyfriend across the country was exhilarating, but the aftermath left many loose ends. Eloise, when busy, was someone who isolated herself from the world. Consequently, without receiving any messages from Eloise, Leonardo fell into another bout of self-irritation. Knowing full well that someone of Eloise's status couldn't devote all her time to him, his twisted possessiveness yearned to monopolize her entire attention. Eloise was busy, especially after becoming Jim's assistant, which he had come to deeply understand. His mind drifted back to the scene from the previous night, when the woman had gently embraced him, whispering in his ear that she was tired. This unease made it difficult for him to concentrate at work. By 2 p.m., unable to restrain himself any longer, he sent a message. "Leonardo, is your office still busy lately?" Within 2 minutes, Eloise called back, startling Leonardo, who quickly retreated to the staff lounge, ensuring privacy before answering. As soon as the call connected, her teasing voice echoed in his ear. "Slacking off at work?" Leonardo was taken aback before denying no. In truth, he had been distracted, not just once, while the culprit teased him over the phone. "Things are still hectic at the office. Focus on your work, don't overthink, okay?" Eloise said, piercing through his thoughts. Leonardo's face heated up, ready to protest, but Eloise cut in, "I'll come find you for dinner tonight." After a moment of hesitation, his voice softly filled the quiet room. "Okay." In the office, as the call ended, the warmth in the woman's face dissipated instantly. Her brow furrowed back into her usual aloofness, and the already chilly atmosphere in the office plunged further, making Luke shiver beside her. "Finished?" "Yes," Luke replied, nerves tightening as he prepared himself, feeling even more tense than during the annual company summary meeting. According to the private investigator, the incident happened over a decade ago. The people who lived near Leonardo's family have dispersed, and there aren't many left who know the details. However, the scandal involving Leonardo's family made headlines at the time. At this, Eloise's mood soured further, the crease between her brows deepening with a hint of hostility. "Get to the point." Luke swallowed nervously, a cold sweat breaking out as his skin tightened. Records show that Leonardo's parents fell in love during college. After graduation, Leonardo's father started from scratch and made a good fortune through years of effort. When Leonardo's mother was pregnant, his father began to have an affair and frequently stayed out all night, claiming to be on business trips. When Leonardo was 7, the mistress approached his mother, aiming for a divorce. Upon learning of her husband's infidelity, Leonardo's mother's mental state crumbled, leading to frequent arguments between the couple. Their disputes became so public that even neighbors were well aware. Embarrassed, Leonardo's father was more determined to divorce. Unable to tolerate his wife's outbursts, he moved in with his mistress, leaving only Leonardo and his mother in the house. Afterward, Leonardo's mother suffered from severe depression and schizophrenia, often beating the young Leonardo, who was still in elementary school. Witnesses from that time recall that Leonardo always had injuries, old wounds healing only to be replaced by new ones. Due to this, Leonardo had no friends, often walking alone at school. At this point, Luke dared a glance at Eloise, seated at her desk, but quickly averted his eyes, holding his breath, unable to utter another word. The air was suffocatingly oppressive. Luke swore he'd never seen Eloise's face so terrifying in the 2 years he'd been with the company. After a few seconds, Eloise's voice broke the silence in the office, chilling the temperature further with her words. "Go on." Luke swallowed nervously once more and continued with dogged determination. According to the case files at the time, the day of the incident marked exactly 2 years since Leonardo's parents had separated. Witness statements indicate that Leonardo's mother called her husband that day, appearing to agree to a divorce. However, upon his arrival, she completely lost control, stabbed him, and then turned the knife on herself, resulting in the immediate loss of both their lives. Leonardo, who was only 10 at the time, was in the living room and witnessed the entire ordeal. Bang! The woman abruptly stood up from her chair, the legs scraping against the floor with a piercing screech that shattered the silence in the office, making everyone's hearts race with fear. On one side of the office was floor-to-ceiling glass design, offering a panoramic view of the city from the high-rise. Eloise would often stand by the window when troubled, watching the traffic and pedestrians below, gradually calming her agitated state. But now, Eloise stared at the scenery outside the window, her face dark, finding it impossible to extinguish the fury within her. She recalled that this matter was mentioned in the initial investigation report, and although she couldn't remember how angry she was back then, it certainly didn't compare to the current intensity of her fury by a tenth. What was once a cursory few sentences now seemed woefully inadequate to describe Leonardo's situation. It felt as if a hand had firmly gripped her heart, not exactly painful, but suffocatingly unbearable. Suddenly reminded of the first time she met Leonardo, she had been captivated by him. More than his appearance, it was the aloofness and world-weariness emanating from him that had firmly captured her attention. It was only now that she understood the kind of darkness from which that compelling aura she found so attractive had been forged. Eloise raised a hand to rub her aching temples, realizing for the first time how much she detested her current self. Continue. Across from her, Luke looked at Eloise's back, his expression turning more solemn after a few seconds. After the tragedy involving Leonardo's family, all the inheritance of Leonardo's parents fell into Leonardo's hands. After a fierce battle between the two families' relatives, Leonardo eventually ended up being raised by his maternal grandparents. However, within 2 years of Leonardo living with them, all the assets were squandered by Leonardo's parents, with the majority being used to support Leonardo's uncle, the younger brother of Leonardo's mother. But according to neighbors of Leonardo's parents, Leonardo had a difficult time being raised by his grandparents. Most of the household chores in the old house were handled by Leonardo, including cleaning and cooking. Although Leonardo's parents did not physically abuse him, their attitude towards him was terrible. Leonardo moved out of the old house after getting into university at 18. During his college years, he applied for and received a full scholarship for his outstanding academic performance. He made a living by participating in various provincial and national competitions, as well as part-time jobs. Upon graduation, he joined a foreign-owned enterprise, but was fired just before being officially hired after discovering that his supervisor was embezzling company funds. The supervisor retaliated by blacklisting him, and as a result, Leonardo remains on many companies' blacklists. By now, it was clear why Leonardo, with his excellent academic record, had not found a job in a formal enterprise but instead became a bartender, and why Jim later approached Leonardo to become his assistant. Eloise's brow remained furrowed as she silently looked out the window at the scenery. After a while, as if she suddenly remembered something, she spoke again. What about his parents' real estate? With both of Leonardo's parents deceased, all their assets fell to Leonardo. While the money in the bank was easy to access, the real estate under Leonardo's name was not so easily stolen. Hearing this, Luke's fingers moved rapidly on the tablet as he hurriedly explained, according to our investigation, Leonardo's parents owned 2 houses, both purchased in full after their marriage. However, when Leonardo was 9, the ownership of one of the houses was secretly transferred to the mistress at the time, while the other, the one where Leonardo's parents lived, is currently occupied by Leonardo's uncle's family. Upon hearing this, Eloise's lips curved slightly, as if in a smile, but those familiar with her knew that this was a sign that someone was about to face serious trouble. Quite impressive, occupying someone else's nest for so long. I wonder if they have nightmares at night. Eloise turned her head and continued, "Where is the house that was given away now?" "It's still in the possession of that woman," Luke said, adding, "Eloise, the Miriam you asked me to investigate is the mistress of Leonardo's father more than 10 years ago and is also the current mistress of Lu Jian." Eloise was momentarily stunned, but she quickly recovered. The truth, though dramatic, made sense when considering the situation closely. It wasn't hard to understand that when Miriam, as a mistress, went to provoke Leonardo's mother, it was very likely that Leonardo was also a bystander. So, at the banquet that day, Leonardo's reaction upon seeing Miriam was so strange, obviously recalling his darkest experiences from back then. A dog returns to its vomit, and it's not surprising that someone who enticed a married man more than 10 years ago is now playing the mistress again. Here is also a contact of one of Leonardo's neighbors at the time, who still lives in the original location. The office fell silent again. A few minutes later, the woman turned around, picked up her cell phone and car keys from the desk, and walked out the door. Send me the phone number and address, and forward the remaining documents to my email. It was the afternoon now, and there weren't many people on the streets. A red Porsche was parked steadily by the roadside, looking quite ostentatious, attracting the attention of many passers-by. However, more eye-catching than the car was the woman standing beside it. A simple yet elegant Chanel-style outfit perfectly showcased the woman's figure. Her long, slightly curled black hair cascaded down her back, a pair of black sunglasses perched on her nose, matching her bright red lipstick, creating a stunning image that captivated the heart. The woman leaned against the car, her expression indifferent, exuding an air of cold beauty. Many passers-by couldn't help but steal glances from afar, whispering to their companions after admiring her from a distance. At that moment, the door of the house in front of Eloise suddenly opened, and an ordinary-looking man walked out. Their eyes met, and he froze on the spot for several seconds before he could react. "David?" Eloise removed the sunglasses from her face, her bright red lips curving into a faint smile, her eyes sparkling with confidence, extremely captivating. David subconsciously responded with an and then his cheeks heated up. His voice, when he spoke again, was tinged with nervousness. "Excuse me, who are you?" "I'm Eloise," Eloise said, standing up straight and walking towards David. "I've come to ask you about something." Feeling an intense pressure as the woman approached, David suddenly felt like he was being inspected by his top boss. His back stiffened, and his tone became cautious. All right, what do you want to know?" Eloise's gaze fell on the trash bag in his hand, and then she raised an eyebrow, asking, "Shall we talk while walking?" Although her tone was consultative, it instilled a sense of subservience. By the time David realized it, he was already walking alongside Eloise down the street. Does David remember Leonardo? Chapter 34. Her breath hitched and her heartbeat skipped a beat. The moonlight streaming in from the balcony was particularly cold and desolate. Eloise's eyes gradually adapted to the darkness as she scanned the situation in the room, her gaze finally landing on the dining table not far away. Various dishes were neatly arranged on the table, appearing quite lavish, and it was easy to imagine how delicious they must have been when freshly cooked. But they were cold now. "You're late," the man repeated once more. 20 minutes late. Eloise opened her lips, wanting to explain, but then found that no amount of explanation seemed to be of any use. "I'm sorry." The man's head was pressed tightly against the side of the woman's ear. Upon hearing Eloise's apology, he suddenly let out a soft laugh, so faint as to be almost imperceptible, yet it clearly fell into Eloise's ears, carrying a hint of coldness and sarcasm, causing Eloise to instinctively want to escape. "Why apologize?" the man said, his deep voice tinged with a faint magnetism, like a beast lurking in the darkness, highly predatory. Leonardo at this moment was something Eloise had never seen before, with an inexplicable sense of eeriness. Men are usually passive in emotions, which might be related to his personality. He never actively approached her, and often subtly revealed his intentions. This led to her having to put in some effort to guess his thoughts during their interactions. Eloise didn't dislike this introverted personality. Sometimes, she even found it quite amusing. However, Leonardo was much bolder than usual at this moment, his nose brushing past her ear, gradually pressing down, following the curve of her neck, slowly invading. Eloise couldn't see his expression at this time. In the quiet and dim space, her sense of hearing and touch were amplified. The man's breath fell on her skin, wave after wave, accompanied by his breathing, making Eloise momentarily unable to cope. Her nose was filled with the fragrance of the man, which was usually so cold, but now it seemed as if it were on fire, making the atmosphere around them become sticky and hot. "Leonardo, let me go first," Eloise said, the creases between her eyebrows deepening. She was not used to the current situation as a dominant person. "Let you go." The man stopped his nose action immediately, and, the next moment, the hand supporting the door panel turned to embrace the woman's slender waist, pulling her tightly into his arms. "If I let you go, where else would you go?" While speaking, his cool lips occasionally brushed against the woman's delicate skin, somewhat greedy to sniff her perfume. In the darkness, Eloise didn't notice the scorching gaze of the man, his eyes rolling with almost insane desire, making one tremble with fear. Eloise could now sense Leonardo's strangeness, although she didn't understand why her tardiness would cause such a big reaction from him. However, it seemed that exploring this issue at the moment was meaningless. Sighing softly, there was a hint of helplessness in her voice. "Leonardo, let me go first, I'm not going anywhere." The man's body paused slightly, and then, the hand embracing Eloise's waist tightened a bit more. "Let's go to the living room, okay?" Eloise said, raising her hand to stroke the man's head, one stroke after another, as if comforting a frightened kitten. "It's a bit tiring standing like this." After a while, the man's tense body finally relaxed gradually, and the arm embracing the woman loosened a bit as an unspoken compromise. However, in the place where the woman couldn't see, the man's eyes were still astonishingly bright, not like an harmless kitten at all, but more like a beast pretending to be submissive in order to achieve its goal. After leaving the man's arms, Eloise led the man's hand towards the living room, guiding him to sit on the sofa. The man was surprisingly obedient, sitting on the sofa and silently lowering his eyes, not letting go of Eloise's hand, quiet to the point of making one feel sorry for him. Eloise squatted in front of him, her other hand gently caressing his cheek. The next moment, Leonardo looked up slightly, a pair of slightly blurred eyes suddenly entering Eloise's sight, causing her heart to tighten instantly. "Haven't eaten?" The woman unconsciously softened her tone, her eyes filled with gentle light tinged with faint guilt. The man's tone was light, his eyelids lowered again, but his cheek subconsciously rubbed against the woman's palm. Such a small action full of strong dependence made Eloise's heart melt again. "Let's eat first, we'll talk after dinner," Eloise said, standing up from the ground, about to walk towards the dining table, but her wrist was pulled tight again. Inadvertently turning her head, she met the man's gaze. In the moonlight, Leonardo's skin seemed to glow, his bangs paired with his exquisite facial features, giving off a fragile beauty. "Order takeout, the dishes have gone cold." Eloise was slightly stunned, then her face immediately broke into a soft smile. "It's fine, I don't mind." However, the man holding her wrist didn't let go and then stood up from the sofa, saying, "Then I'll heat up the dishes before we eat." "Okay." After the cold dishes were heated, they lost some of their original flavor. This dinner should have been incredibly warm, but no one knew it would end up like this. The scene seemed to be back to normal, yet it carried a faint sense of unnaturalness. Both of them had their own thoughts, and they seemed to sense the other's hidden thoughts, but neither broke the surface calm. After dinner, it was nearly 9 o'clock. Eloise was on the phone at the balcony, and Leonardo was washing dishes in the kitchen. September nights still carried a hint of coolness. Having removed her jacket, she only wore a white tank top, her long hair draped behind her. Occasionally, when a breeze passed, stray hairs brushed against her cheeks, setting off a sense of etherealness in her expression. "I want the results of this within half a month. Leave no room for anything else," Eloise said, the seemingly casual words carrying a bone-chilling coldness, more like a death knell from the depths of hell. A few seconds later, Eloise hung up the phone, lit the lady's cigarette she had held between her fingers, narrowed her eyes, took a puff, and then skillfully exhaled a smoke ring. She rarely smoked. Only when extremely excited or exceptionally irritated would she have a few puffs. She was an extremely disciplined person, unlike some who had a strong dependence on nicotine, as if smoking alone could dissipate worries. Such thinking seemed extremely foolish to Eloise, just a means for the incapable to deceive themselves. However, recently, she seemed to be gradually understanding why those people liked smoking so much. The cigarettes had been in the car for a while, and she had taken one while stuck in traffic. She had also unconsciously brought the cigarettes with her before going upstairs. She had thought she wouldn't need them, but unexpectedly, she was now smoking again. The red ember flickered in the darkness. Eloise leaned against the balcony railing, her slender figure falling into the man's eyes, giving him an uncontrollable sense of weightlessness. Leonardo watched the woman on the balcony expressionlessly, his eyes darkening slightly. After a while, he stepped towards Eloise's direction. Hearing footsteps, Eloise was about to turn her head when the man's arm suddenly stretched across her waist, her shoulder bearing weight, and her center of gravity slightly sinking. Although it was a position of being leaned upon, the woman was firmly confined in the man's embrace, unable to struggle at all. Eloise didn't notice anything unusual, just turned her head slightly and spoke in a doting tone. "Done cleaning up?" The man's chin rested on the woman's shoulder, his lips gently pressed against her soft hair, his eyelids lowered, concealing the stormy thoughts in his heart. The next moment, his gaze fell on the cigarette between Eloise's fingers. The faint tobacco scent lingered around him, and his mind immediately flashed back to a few months ago when the woman leaned against the car, asking him if they should be together. How long can one's enthusiasm last? How much sincerity remains from that time until now? After knowing and understanding his ugliness, how long will she stay by his side? Thinking of this, the man's arms around the woman began to tighten gradually, his head nuzzling, brushing aside the hair on her shoulder blades, his lips carefully pressed against them, restraining the rampant possessiveness in his heart. Eloise was slightly startled, her hand holding the cigarette suspended in midair. Today's Leonardo seemed unusually passionate, but it wasn't hard to understand. Although she didn't know why her tardiness touched him so, it was clear that he was extremely insecure now. "What's bothering you?" the man suddenly asked, the tone of his voice seemingly casual, but it made Eloise's heartbeat skip a beat. After a few seconds, Eloise raised an eyebrow and replied indifferently, "Nothing, just a small matter at the company." Leonardo looked at the cigarette burning halfway, his eyes colder. Such talk for children, he naturally didn't believe. "I want to try it." The breeze brushed past her ears, carrying the man's voice, and fell into Eloise's ears. Eloise hadn't reacted initially, but a few seconds later she realized, raising the cigarette in her hand. She turned her head and asked, "Want to try this?" As Leonardo spoke, he kept his arm around the woman's waist without loosening his grip, while his other hand reached toward the cigarette she was holding. However, Eloise seemed to sense his intention and subtly withdrew her arm, evading his move. In the instant Eloise turned, Leonardo let go of her waist, and his expression immediately softened, the shadows in his eyes receding. All the gloom that had enveloped him seemed to dissipate suddenly. Leaning against the railing, Eloise propped herself up with her elbows. Under the moonlight, her perfect collarbones and elegant shoulders were exposed to the air, and a valuable pendant hung in the center, contrasting beautifully with her fair skin, alluringly captivating. The woman's eyes narrowed, exuding a gentle laziness that was lethally seductive. "Don't bother trying, it's not anything good." As Eloise spoke, the orange-red ember continued to burn, trailing a wisp of white smoke that danced before Leonardo's eyes. The man stared intently at Eloise, then stepped forward, bracing his hands on the railing behind her, locking her once again in his embrace. Leonardo lowered his head slightly, his bangs casting a shadow over his forehead, his gaze exceptionally intense in the darkness of the night. "Teach me." With a stubborn tone, his expressionless face and the man's call of "honey" made Eloise instantly lose her resistance. Eloise chuckled softly, with a hint of resignation and amusement. "Really want to try?" The man did not respond verbally, but his silence had already given her a definite answer. Eloise raised an eyebrow, and a few seconds later, she took a puff of the cigarette in front of the man, then tiptoed to embrace his neck, pressing her lips firmly against his. The soft sensation on his lips startled the man, and after a moment, his eyes darkened, his grip on the railing tightening as if suppressing something. A mouthful of smoke was slowly passed over, entering his throat and gradually seeping into his lungs. It was an unprecedented experience, one that first-time smokers often couldn't handle. Coughing violently almost as soon as Eloise pulled away, his eyes began to redden. After an unknown period, Leonardo finally recovered, his eyes watery as he looked at Eloise, a red tinge in his gaze. Meeting Leonardo's gaze, Eloise paused, feeling an overwhelming wave of emotion that was suffocating. However, in the span of a second, the tide receded, as if the sensation had been an illusion. When she looked again, there were no extraneous emotions in those eyes, and even Eloise couldn't tell if he was choked from the smoke or because of. Feeling bad? Eloise asked, the cigarette nearly burned down to the end. As she released her grip, the butt of the cigarette fell to the ground, and Eloise stamped out the remaining spark with her foot. I told you, it's not a good thing. Almost as soon as the words left her lips, the man suddenly grasped the woman's wrist, placed it on his shoulder, and with his other hand, cupped the back of her head, accurately capturing her lips, seeking the remaining taste of tobacco. Eloise was taken aback, and the next moment, she turned passive into active, cradling the man's face, closing her eyes, immersing herself in the kiss the man had initiated. Their breaths intertwined, their lips and teeth meeting, and under the woman's deliberate guidance, the man also learned how to respond, moving from simple compliance to gradually learning how to meet her halfway. It was a lesson, a hands-on tutorial from an experienced driver to a novice, and the evidence showed that Leonardo was an exceptionally smart student. After an unknown period, just as Eloise released him, her upper lip was unexpectedly licked, as if savoring the moment or trying to hold on. Eloise chuckled, looking at the man's slightly swollen lips, still glistening faintly, strangely seductive. Lifting her hand to gently wipe the man's lips with her thumb, but before she could withdraw her hand, the man suddenly broke the silence. Am I still within my freshness period? Eloise's hand paused, and after a moment, she responded. Yes, you always have been. Eloise said softly, but with seriousness. I've told you, I'm serious. From the moment I met you until now, I have an inexhaustible interest in you. Leonardo met the woman's ardent gaze, his eyes filled with a complex, inscrutable emotion. He didn't dare to ask about the future, afraid that the answer might not be what he hoped for. Holding the woman's hand that had brushed against his lips, Leonardo's expression suddenly shifted, turning somewhat dim and cautious. Sorry, I've been having nightmares lately. Maybe I haven't been sleeping well, which is why this is happening. Eloise suddenly remembered the 2 boxes of medicine he had in his suitcase and felt a pang of heartache. Then I'll sleep with you, okay? As expected, the man's ears turned a shade of red in the next moment, his gaze lowered, his eyelashes trembling lightly, seemingly embarrassed and flustered by the woman's words. At 10:30, in a dimly lit room, only a small lamp on the nightstand was faintly glowing, emitting a warm yellow light. Eloise sat on the edge of the bed, watching Leonardo's sleeping profile, and the irritability of the day began to gradually dissipate. The sound of the man's steady breathing reached her ears, and Eloise's gaze softened considerably. A few minutes later, the woman stood up from the bed, turned off the lamp on the nightstand, and then quietly left the bedroom. And as the woman closed the door, the man on the bed, who should have been asleep, suddenly opened his eyes, the emotions churning in his pupils clear, with not a trace of sleepiness. U.S. Corporation Branch, President's Office. How is the matter proceeding? Eloise sat at the desk, reviewing the documents in her hand, her expression cold and serious as usual. Luke seemed to have anticipated that Eloise would ask about this, and after a mere 2 seconds, he replied, "The bait has been set, and we've put down $500,000 so far." "It's not enough." Eloise frowned slightly, her tone merciless. "I want it 10 times that amount." $5 million was undoubtedly a monumental figure for ordinary people. Luke seemed caught off guard by Eloise's ruthlessness, but then recalled his boss's past style and felt less surprised. Understood. What about Miriam? The various procedures are almost complete, and a lawsuit will be filed with the court in a couple of days. Luke said, as if remembering something else. He continued, she seems to be trying to gather information as well, aiming to find out who is the one suing her. As soon as the words fell, a cold laugh echoed in the office, making Luke shiver involuntarily. It doesn't matter. There's no need to hide it intentionally. If she has the guts, let her come find me herself. With that, Eloise signed her name on the document, then slapped it closed and handed it to Luke, who was standing beside her. Eloise, I'll be going now. Half a minute later, the spacious office fell silent again, and Eloise immediately relaxed, leaning back in her chair, massaging her sore temples. At that moment, the screen of the mobile phone on the desk lit up suddenly, a text message popping up. Eloise glanced at the phone screen. Seeing a familiar name, her eyes immediately softened. Leonardo, regarding the previous investment case, there are a few details that Align Corporation would like to revise. With a serious tone, Eloise could almost imagine the expression the man had when typing this message. Eloise, fine. Eloise, come to my apartment tonight to discuss. A few minutes later, the other party responded, after dinner? Eloise, let's eat out. I'll pick you up after work. Leonardo, okay. After exiting the text messages, Eloise looked at the man's sleeping profile on the phone screen, the corners of her mouth curling up in a smile she was not aware of. The dimly lit room was filled with smoke, the long-sealed space reeking of pungent tobacco and sweat. The ashtray beside it was already piled high with cigarette butts, still emitting irritating white smoke. The sound of card games rose and fell, occasionally accompanied by bursts of hilarity. The extremely oppressive air, the sealed room, the surrounding uproar, all of this caused people's emotions to be in an extremely elevated state, while their rationality was gradually collapsing. Logan, you'd better think carefully. Chasing after this will cost you $1 million. At the table, the man gritted his teeth, his gaze fixed on the cards in his hand, the veins on his forehead bulging, a bead of sweat the size of a bean rolling down from his temple. A few seconds later, the man slammed his hand on the mahjong table, roaring fiercely. I'm in. Chapter 35. At 5:50 p.m., as Leonardo returned from the finance department to the president's office, he hadn't even stepped inside when he heard a commotion. Why is Eloise here all of a sudden? Oh, Eloise coming to Align Corporation is obviously to see our gym. Is there a problem with the previous project, or is she just here for a meal with our gym? Leonardo paused mid-step, his expression darkened instantly, his lips pressed tight, and a hint of gloom settled in his brow. He halted at the entrance of the president's office, standing there, observing the woman sitting on the sofa not far away, his gaze obscure. Eloise seemed quite popular, even among the staff at Align Corporation, surrounded by assistants on her left serving tea and on her right offering warm greetings. She sat at the center of the sofa, smiling radiantly. His grip tightened around the documents in his hand as he stood in the shadows, his face expressionless, his gaze coldly fixed on the woman on the sofa, sending shivers down one's spine. Eloise indeed had a good relationship with the people at Align Corporation, as she visited often, and the two companies were mostly in collaboration, naturally minimizing any hostility. Moreover, the staff in the president's office were relatively young, not overly bound by hierarchy, serious at work but playful in private, often teasing even Jim occasionally. Eloise, with her beauty and competence, appealed more to the young crowd than the delicate socialites, her regal persona winning over the office staff who held her in high regard, especially since she and their boss were childhood friends, often pairing them in their thoughts, making her visits always warmly received. Just like now. With less than 10 minutes until the end of the workday, Eloise rushed over after wrapping up early. She intended to catch Leonardo off guard and had never seen him at work in the company, so she arrived directly, only to find herself early. Eloise was aware of the intentions of Jim's assistants and initially found it harmless, just playful banter, and she could handle it, so she let them tease her. However, things were different now. She had a boyfriend and couldn't let them continue pairing her off. "Business, we need to discuss the details of the investment case," Eloise said, her gaze flicking towards the door. Instantly, the gloom on the man's face dissipated, the harshness in his brow gone. Though his expression remained unchanged, his demeanor transformed dramatically in a blink. Seeing Leonardo at the door, Eloise paused, setting down her teacup. Before she could speak, the man stepped forward first, saying, "Eloise, you're here to see Jim, right? I'll take you to the conference room." Eloise raised an eyebrow at his blatant pretext, but stood up from the sofa, saying, "All right." Following his lead, they walked towards the conference room, under the watchful eyes of everyone. Dressed in a formal suit and with a serious tone, he looked quite convincing. The president's office staff didn't suspect a thing, so when they saw the conference room door close, they returned to their posts, preparing to leave. In the quiet, sealed conference room, the atmosphere turned slightly amorous with the two alone. Leonardo turned to see the woman leaning against the conference table, arms crossed, knees slightly bent, her gaze teasing, her red lips curling seductively. Why did Assistant Leonardo close the door? Eloise watched as the man approached, and when they were just a step apart, she tugged at his tie, pulling him closer. The man complied almost entirely, bending down slightly, their faces almost touching, just a fist's distance apart. "Why are you here?" Leonardo asked, placing the folder on the table behind the woman and supporting himself with his hands, encircling her in his embrace. "Didn't I say it? To pick you up." Leonardo knew Eloise would come. He just thought she'd wait for him as before, either downstairs or in the parking lot, not daring to imagine she'd boldly come to the president's office. Recalling the scene of the woman surrounded by a few people earlier, his brows unconsciously furrowed, and the suppressed darkness resurfaced uncontrollably. Eloise felt Leonardo's distraction, tightening her grip on his tie, pulling him back to focus. "What, don't want me here?" The man paused, then pursed his lips, "No." Then, as if remembering something, Leonardo added, "How did you get up here?" "I have a pass guard," Eloise replied matter-of-factly. "With so many collaboration projects between QS Corporation and Align Corporation, of course, they'd let me up." "Huh?" Hearing this, Leonardo remembered the close relationship between the woman before him and his current boss, childhood friends, inseparable companions. Maybe before he joined Align Corporation, she had visited Jim like this many times. His ears rang with the earlier jesting, his expression cooled further. Yet, as the man was lost in thought, the woman below him suddenly spoke. "Is this glass one way?" Leonardo gave a slight start, looking in the direction indicated by Eloise to see the large glass wall, and answered instinctively, yes. The design of the Align Corporation conference room featured large one-way glass, allowing those inside to see out, but not vice versa. Originally meant to prevent employees from slacking off during meetings, it now unexpectedly benefited someone else. "I see," Eloise said, tightening her grip on his tie. Then, under his gaze, she slowly raised her chin, pressing her lips to his cheek. In the next instant, the man's body stiffened, his eyes darkening significantly. "Shall we do something naughty?" she teased, enticing the virtuous scholar to fall. His Adam's apple moved, his voice hoarse as he replied, "It's almost time to leave." Despite his words, he stood motionless, not stopping her bold actions. "5 minutes is enough," Eloise said, not giving him a chance to refuse. She sealed his lips, savoring this delightful appetizer. The tie still in her grip, as if surrendering everything to her. After a few seconds, the man finally closed his eyes, enjoying the forbidden intimacy in the vast conference room during this stolen time. Just then, a commotion arose outside the conference room door, causing the man's back to stiffen, his eyes snapping open. "Why hasn't Jim come yet?" "I don't know. Isn't Jim talking with Manager Jiang downstairs? Shouldn't Assistant Leonardo and Eloise be all right in there?" Probably, Jim must have asked assistant Leonardo to chat with Eloise. The conference room door wasn't locked, and he hadn't anticipated Eloise's antics in the office. Intending to step back, but the woman didn't give him a chance to escape, her teeth lightly biting his lower lip, sending a sting, as if punishing his lack of focus. His pupils trembled, a blush spreading from his ears to his cheeks, then down his neck. Should I enter and say something? It's already past the official work-ending time now. Hearing this, Leonardo's heart leaped to his throat, and the woman also opened her eyes. Their gazes locked, yet Leonardo saw no panic in her eyes. What was going on? Wasn't she afraid? What if they opened the door? Leonardo frowned, his hands that had been supporting the conference table now gripping the woman's shoulders, signaling her to stop her reckless behavior. However, the woman was brazen, seeing the man's flustered state. A smile flashed in her eyes, yet she didn't let him go. After a few seconds, Leonardo couldn't handle the thrill anymore, pushing Eloise away forcefully. Their lips parted, perhaps too fiercely, leaving his thin lips glistening, Eloise's lipstick smeared on his mouth, smudged outside his lips. "Eloise!" Leonardo growled low, with a mixture of teeth-gritting and embarrassed anger. Yet Eloise still tightly held his tie, not intending to stop. His mind went blank, tightly closing his eyes as if ready to break the jar. The discussion outside the door continued. Forget it, assistant Leonardo's character, always with a stern face, cold as a male merciless master. That one glare of his last time froze me solid, okay? You're right, he's terrifying. Let's just go. With that, the voices outside gradually faded, and when they completely disappeared, Eloise finally released his lips. "Time's up," Eloise said, a triumphant smile flashing across her face. The man's face was flushed, his meticulously arranged collar now disheveled, his eyes slightly red, his pupils like they were veiled in mist, a bit dazed. Always with a stern face, male merciless master? Eloise looked at the man before her, unable to connect Leonardo with these descriptions. This wasn't merciless master at all. Look at this adorable expression. How could it be related to merciless? At this moment, Leonardo seemed to have finally snapped back to reality, glaring fiercely at Eloise, his look mixed with shame and indignation, making Eloise chuckle. That little glare, her heart melted. "I enjoyed this interaction. Shall we continue next time?" Eloise said, raising her thumb to wipe the lipstick that had smeared outside the man's lips, her beautiful lips stained with a touch of crimson, making Eloise narrow her eyes slightly. This shade looks good." "No, next time," he replied. As Leonardo spoke, he raised his hand to retrieve the documents placed on the conference table, then, with a stern expression, turned and strode towards the exit of the meeting room. Seeing the man's indignant departure, Eloise's smile deepened, knowing he was momentarily too embarrassed to accept the situation and thus had thrown a tantrum. They had agreed on 5 minutes, but no one actually paid attention to how long they had kissed. By the time Leonardo left the meeting room, nearly everyone from the president's office had already departed, with only 1 or 2 remaining to tidy up the documents. However, upon seeing Leonardo's terrifying expression, they dared not speak, only their gazes landing on Leonardo's assistant whose ears had turned a deep red, leaving them momentarily bewildered. Eloise left the meeting room right after Leonardo, not daring to tease him further, and headed to the underground parking lot by herself. Meanwhile, as Leonardo was packing up to leave for the day, he received a text message from Eloise. His lips instinctively tightened, and when he realized what he was doing, his expression became inexpressibly complex. "Eloise, I'm waiting for you in the parking lot." The unexpected encounter was too thrilling. He couldn't imagine what the scene would have been like if the staff outside had suddenly burst in. He wanted to stand beside Eloise, to become her exclusive possession, but without certainty about the future, he was even more afraid to expose their relationship to the public eye. He was afraid that someone would think he didn't deserve it, because even he felt he wasn't qualified to stand by her side. Desiring closeness while maintaining distance. This twisted emotion tormented his heart, constantly pulling him into the abyss. They had dinner at a simple Chinese restaurant. When it came time to pay, Eloise was about to take out her wallet when Leonardo beat her to it, his action swift and decisive, showing more CO style than her at this moment. Eloise understood the man's pride. In her previous relationships, the men usually paid for meals to save face in front of others, though they readily accepted the gifts and resources she provided in private. In the past, relationships had merely been a pastime for her, akin to how girls enjoyed raising virtual characters in games, being particularly interested in the numerical processes within their phones, willing to spend a lot of money just for fun. She was no different, except while others played with virtual characters, she engaged with real people. Nonetheless, her years of upbringing prevented her from engaging in anything more excessive. What she sought was merely emotional gratification in the short term, not a physical transaction under the guise of mere money. Moreover, her desires in that aspect were not particularly strong. Compared to passionate embraces or further intimate actions, she preferred having a handsome man quietly by her side, serving as a simple yet exquisite decoration. Thus, in those past relationships, her intimate moments with her ex-boyfriends were always kept at a polite distance. Yet, inexplicably, in front of Leonardo, it was as if some restraint had been broken, causing her to lose control, constantly wanting to get closer and even closer. In driving back to their apartment, Eloise deeply suspected if her young boyfriend had somehow bewitched her because she kept thinking about doing naughty things. Don't do that anymore. In the quiet car, the man's voice suddenly sounded calm and indifferent. Eloise glanced slightly in the rearview mirror, where the man's head was bowed, his gaze faint, seemingly lost in thought. "How so?" she asked knowingly. "Can't kiss you." The atmosphere suddenly grew heavy. The man sat quietly in the passenger seat, without the embarrassment or anger Eloise had expected, just sitting there, yet unexpectedly tugging at her heartstrings. "You know I can't resist." "Then don't resist," Eloise said, gripping the steering wheel tighter, her expression becoming more serious. "Eloise, I'm not like those others." Leonardo's fingers were tightly interlocked, as if suppressing something, his pale fingertips making Eloise feel even more heartache. Eloise wasn't stupid. She knew what she meant by those others, referring to her previous boyfriends. Leonardo's sensitive nature wasn't hard to guess. He was afraid that his experiences would merely follow in the footsteps of those before him, that he would be toyed with and then mercilessly discarded. The closer and more intimate they became, the more anxious he felt. A faint bitterness rose. Eloise's brow furrowed slightly, and after a few seconds, she spoke again. "Leonardo, I've never lumped you together with them. I've told you I'm serious." The man remained silent, saying nothing. After a while, Eloise withdrew her gaze from the rearview mirror. Nonetheless, unnoticed by the woman, the man's fingers tightened their interlock, his eyes obscured beneath his bangs, churning with an unsettling intensity of emotion. The corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly, creating an eerie, almost imperceptible curve, which vanished as quickly as it had appeared, returning to its previous state. Like a wave surging, receding just before it hits the dam, returning to calm. He wasn't sure how serious her serious was, but he knew that even a downright lie could become truth after being hinted at 100 times. This is known as the Goebbels effect. The truly sure win in hunting is to make the prey always believe they have the upper hand. At 7 o'clock, the red Porsche stopped at the apartment building. Since they would be sending Leonardo back later, they didn't park in the underground garage. Fortunately, the property belonged to QS Corporation, and the entire building was nominally Eloise's private asset, so parking downstairs wasn't an issue. It was already late, and although there were streetlights in the community, their warm yellow light wasn't very bright, making the road still quite dim. Just as Eloise and Leonardo got out of the car, a woman's voice suddenly came from behind. "Eloise." Eloise paused, turned to look at the source of the voice, and soon the woman emerged from the shadows. "Miriam?" Eloise raised an eyebrow, her gaze instinctively moving to Leonardo. As expected, the man's face turned particularly ghastly, not as pale as at the banquet but close. "Is there something?" Eloise asked, her mind having already guessed. Frankly, given Miriam's methods, she shouldn't have been able to find this place, but Eloise had no intention of hiding and instead had Luke leak the information. But she hadn't expected Miriam to come so quickly. It seemed the house was really important to her. In her excitement, Miriam hadn't noticed the man next to Eloise, her gaze fixed on Eloise, her tone urgent and resentful. "Eloise, I don't know when I offended you, for you to go to such lengths behind my back." At this, Eloise raised her eyebrows and said, "You didn't offend me. Then why are you helping an insignificant person to interfere with this matter? The house was already transferred to my name, and now that Leonardo's family has passed away, what's the point of you taking this to court?" Miriam swore she was stunned when she received the lawyer's letter. She never thought that after so many years, someone would bring this up again. The house was something she had coaxed and begged her lad for, stooping to ingratiate herself for a long time to get it. After being by his side for so many years, wasn't it reasonable to ask for a house? But the house had been transferred behind his wife's back, and she had expected trouble, only to find the woman went mad halfway, killing her lad and then herself. Over the years, the house's market value had skyrocketed, worth tens of millions if sold. How could she let go of it? Moreover, she had established herself with an independent image in the circle and recently managed to hook up with Lu Jian. If she lost the house now, how could she continue to get by? Miriam's expression grew increasingly distorted. In her panic, she didn't notice Leonardo's expression when he heard Leonardo's family, his gaze suddenly becoming exceptionally somber, like turbulent waves in the night, somewhat terrifying. "You didn't offend me. With your status, you're not worthy," Eloise said, crossing her arms, looking down at the woman with disdain and arrogance, making Miriam's complexion turn extremely embarrassed in an instant. Secretly cursing Eloise, she dared not reveal any anger on the surface. "Then why are you?" "Because you took something that wasn't yours, you occupied what didn't belong to you through dirty means," Eloise said, her eyes flashing with cold light, her words sharp as blades, sentencing Miriam to death by flaying. The woman's face turned pale in an instant, standing frozen, her lips slightly parted, yet she was speechless for several seconds. "Eloise, this doesn't concern." "It certainly concerns me," Eloise said, placing a hand gently over the man's clenched fist, feeling his trembling body, her gaze growing fiercer. "Because I'm protective, I want to take back everything he lost, one by one." As her words fell, the man's head jerked up, staring at the woman beside him, feeling the anger in her eyes, his heart uncontrollably racing. Chapter 36. The atmosphere suddenly turned solemn, and Miriam was left in a daze, the echo of Eloise's words reverberating in her ears. She then seemed to suddenly realize something, her gaze falling on the intertwined hands of the couple in front of her. You're Leonardo?" Miriam stared blankly at the man beside Eloise, recalling the scene from half a month ago at the birthday banquet. At the time, she had just thought the young man beside Eloise was handsome and automatically categorized him as Eloise's little boyfriend, so she didn't pay much attention. How could she have known he was actually Leonardo? She remembered that over a decade ago, the boy was just a child under 10, and she thought he wouldn't amount to anything. Little did she expect that he would become so capable as an adult. He even managed to team up with Eloise to double-cross her. In Miriam's mind, she had already concluded that this disaster was orchestrated by Leonardo behind the scenes, with the purpose of avenging her for what she did back then. A trace of resentment flashed in her eyes, but the situation at hand didn't allow her to show any displeasure. Leonardo didn't speak, simply standing there quietly after withdrawing his gaze. However, the tense muscles and the storm in his eyes revealed just how unsettled he was. To Leonardo, Miriam in front of him was undoubtedly one of the culprits of his dark childhood. If it weren't for his father's infidelity and her brazen appearance, maybe his mother wouldn't have fallen into depression back then, nor would she have treated him that way, and their once happy family wouldn't have been shattered. He knew that tragedies were never one-sided, but she was indeed the perpetrator who destroyed his family back then. A torrent of hatred surged up, the man's eyes flickering with fierce, murderous intent. Miriam, meeting his gaze, subconsciously took a few steps back, feeling a sense of facing death. A layer of cold sweat formed on the woman's back, and the instinct for survival made her reflexively want to escape. Devil! Her heart screamed in terror, yet within just 2 seconds, the man in front of her seemed to suddenly change, all his aggression instantly dissipating. Under the warm yellow light, his pale complexion was non-threatening, and his completely vulnerable posture made Miriam begin to doubt that the previous scene was just her illusion. After a 2-second pause, Miriam remembered the market price of that apartment, then gritted her teeth and forced a somewhat obsequious smile, saying, "Leo, the past is long gone. Auntie knows she was wrong, so can you let me off this time? And that house was originally promised to me by your father himself. I was in the prime of my youth, and the most precious years of my life were spent with your father. That apartment is what I deserve." At this, Eloise couldn't help but scoff, her full disdain puncturing the woman's seemingly wronged facade. What, being a mistress gives you a sense of superiority? By your logic, should we give you an award as one of the top 10 moving china figures someday? Eloise said, the loathing in her eyes evident. She despised people like this the most, doing the most despicable things while trying to stand on a moral high ground, a common occurrence in their circle. They shout, true love above all, yet engage in degenerate acts that tarnish love and marriage. If you're doing something shameful, just accept being beaten, scolded, and despised. Why do you have to gild yourself? Her gaze returned to Leonardo. Under the light, the man's brows were slightly furrowed, his lips tightly pressed, his bloodless face fragile and heartbreaking. Another surge of anger rose within Eloise. She gripped Leonardo's hand tighter, forcefully interlacing her fingers with his, locking them together. Leonardo's eyes flashed with a hint of dark light. Feeling the woman's small action, his blood began to boil, gradually melting his frozen heart. A few seconds later, the man tightly returned her grip, the instant warmth further fueling the rampant desire, though his expression remained unchanged, concealing all his obsession. Eloise's words were indeed harsh, but at this moment, Miriam couldn't care less about her face and self-esteem, forcing a smile as she continued to look at Leonardo. "Leo, that house is really important to Auntie. Auntie is almost half buried, but you're different, you're young, and with your abilities, buying a house is effortless. Besides, this happened over a decade ago. If we really go to court, the outcome is uncertain. Why waste the time and effort?" At this, Eloise's mouth curved again, turning slightly to whisper in the man's ear, her face exuding an aura of arrogance and confidence. "Leonardo, don't worry. Whatever you want, I can help you get it back." Such arrogant words from Eloise's mouth didn't seem out of place at all, but like a death sentence for Miriam. Eloise's gaze fell on Miriam's panicked face, her smile deepening. "Miss Jean, you probably haven't looked into the QS Corporation's legal team, have you? It might be worth your while to check them out, don't you think?" At this moment, Miriam's smile was completely unmaintainable. She knew how arrogant Eloise was in their circle, and with her status, there was no way she could win against Eloise. Damn it! How did this punk manage to hook up with Eloise? It's just relying on his looks, isn't it? Just like her back then, rising through the ranks by body, so what right does he have now to take her things? "Leo, if that's not enough, I can sell the house and give you half the remaining money as compensation for all these years, okay?" Miriam said, painfully making her biggest concession. Eloise was about to laugh in anger. Though oddballs were common, someone as boneheaded as Miriam was truly rare. Although it had been a long time since the property transfer, if this case really went to court, winning wasn't difficult, just a bit of effort in gathering evidence, but this was insignificant to the QS Corporation legal team. It was already a done deal, so how could she be so brazen as to haggle? Half? Not even a cent was willing to be given. Leonardo, the choice is in your hands. If you want it, you can file a lawsuit with the court within 3 days, with a 95% chance of winning, Eloise said, staring straight at Leonardo by her side, not mentioning the second option. She didn't want him to let off anyone who had bullied him back then. Moreover, even if Leonardo let Miriam go this time, she wouldn't give her a chance to have an easy life either. Thinking of this, Eloise's eyes darkened. The atmosphere fell silent again. Just when Eloise thought he would let Miriam go, the man's voice suddenly sounded in her ear, carried by the night breeze, entering Eloise's ears. After 10 years of occupation, it's time to give it back. The study was exceptionally quiet, with the two sitting side by side at the desk. The computer screen displayed dense text and paper documents were spread out on the desk, filled with annotations. Eloise wore simple casual clothes, her black hair loosely tied up with a rubber band, a pair of low-prescription glasses with golden rims resting on her nose bridge, looking more serene compared to her sharp aura earlier. The woman closed the pen in her hand, took off the glasses, and massaged her sore temples, her voice a bit weary as she spoke. Let's stop here for today. The investment case had been discussed in advance by the two companies, and initially, there didn't seem to be any issues. So when she received Leonardo's message this afternoon, she instinctively thought the detailed discussion was just a ruse for him to meet, only to find out after the discussion that there were indeed a few small loopholes. In the nearly 40-minute conversation, Eloise could really feel that Leonardo was a capable person. She knew Leonardo was excellent in academics and had an edge in professional theory, but what she didn't expect was that the man was no less experienced in practical operations than veterans, with every point he made being particularly astute, sometimes even surprising her. As for the scene downstairs, both intentionally didn't mention it again, as if it were insignificant, immediately diving into work as soon as they entered the apartment. Late into the night, the warm yellow light from the study fell on the two, creating an odd sense of harmony. Eloise glanced at Leonardo beside her, now in just a white shirt without his suit jacket, his tie nowhere to be seen, the top 2 buttons of his collar undone, appearing more casual than at the company. A faint sense of youthfulness washed over, causing Eloise's eyes to darken, and then she stood up from the chair, saying, as Eloise stepped out of the study to fetch some water, she didn't notice the youthfulness dissipating from the man's demeanor in an instant. His gaze, once placid, turned remarkably profound. The living room was unlit, and after Eloise had filled a glass in the kitchen, she didn't return to the study immediately. Instead, she stood in the spacious living area, gazing at the scenery beyond the glass wall. She adored this design, not just in her office, but also in the living room of her apartment. Overlooking the city felt like escaping the hustle and bustle, soothing her restless heart. Recalling the scene from an hour ago, Leonardo had finally, as she hoped, not backed down. This should have been a joyful matter, yet she felt no delight. She wondered whether her presumptuous actions were good or bad for him. The past should be the experience he least wanted exposed, yet she had intruded forcefully into this drama out of her own desires. However, did regaining these things hold any significance for him? Would his wounds heal with those 2 apartments? Throughout her 2 decades of life, Eloise had never felt so helpless, doubting her decisions for the first time, feeling at a loss. Leonardo's appearance felt more like a calamity, and she knew she would eventually fall into it. As the woman pondered, another person's reflection suddenly appeared on the glass wall. Before Eloise could react, the man embraced her from behind. The sudden scent of cold fragrance made her pause, but she quickly recovered and asked, "What's this, Leonardo the assistant? Workplace harassment?" In response to her teasing, Leonardo seemed to have grown accustomed to it. He remained silent, holding her tighter. After entering the apartment, Eloise had removed her makeup and changed into casual clothes, but the neckline was large, and her hair was tied up, exposing much skin to the moonlight, dazzlingly white. With emotions swirling in his eyes, The man's gaze lingered on the delicate skin as his voice, unusually deep, asked, "Do you dislike me?" "Dislike what?" Eloise's brow slightly furrowed. "You know," Leonardo said, his expression seemingly fragile and hurt, but his eyes held a hidden complexity. He knew he couldn't hide. Since Eloise received that call, his past would likely be exposed. A cheating father, a mother with schizophrenia, and he was the child raised in that environment. Witnessing his mother stab his father, then her suicide, watching the knife go in and out, large amounts of blood flowing, and he stood emotionless in the living room, without crying, screaming, or panic. Leonardo knew he was no longer normal, not after enduring long-term beatings and mental control. Yet for so many years, he had disguised himself as an ordinary person, gradually forgetting this fact until Eloise's appearance rekindled the abnormality hidden within him. "No," Eloise said, her expression exceptionally serious. "Leonardo, everyone has a past, but I'm not one to dwell on once upon a time. I see your present. But if one day you find I'm not what you imagined, will you leave me?" Leonardo spoke, his lips hovering an inch from her skin, his bangs falling, obscuring his eyes and the madness within. Eloise frowned but didn't answer him. Her silence battered the man's reason, his grip on her waist tightening. Just as he was about to lose control, Eloise slowly spoke. "Leonardo, self-denial is pointless. What you should do is seize what you have now, not imagine baseless futures." The man paused, and after a moment, his lips finally lightly touched her cool skin, his nose following the curve of her shoulder blades, up her neck, to her ear, where he whispered with a magnetic voice. "So, are you mine now?" Like the devil's whisper, but Eloise didn't notice anything amiss, merely responding with an "yeah." With that affirmation, a satisfied smile briefly touched the man's lips before being devoured by the remaining possessiveness. His arm around her tightened, and in the darkness, his eyes shone like a nocturnal panther, filled with wildness. He would be obedient once caught, he would never let go again. In 3 days, the QS Corporation legal team submitted the prepared appeal to the court. In the days leading up to the formal trial, negotiations continued behind the scenes. Miriam's side sought an escape route, but QS Corporation's style was to leave no room for others. No amount of struggle mattered. Within half a month, without waiting for the trial, the other party conceded defeat, promising to complete the transfer of ownership within 5 days. The war ended as soon as the smoke began. Though filled with resentment, Miriam had no recourse. Upon receiving the summons, she truly panicked. After inquiring, the message she received was sure to lose. If the trial proceeded, the loss might not be limited to the house. The opposing lawyer could seek additional compensation, and over a decade, if seriously pursued, she couldn't afford it even with bankruptcy. On the 3rd day of the settlement, the house was officially transferred to Leonardo's name. Miriam dared not delay, fearing he might change his mind. Leonardo sold the house the next day for $12 million. Undeniably, Leonardo's father had a poor character but a good business mind. The house he gave Miriam was about 200 square meters, and over 10 years, the surrounding area had developed into a bustling commercial district, truly precious land. No wonder Miriam was so reluctant to let go at first. As October approached, the weather gradually cooled, with a hint of bleakness, like the path of some individuals reaching its end. The man walked through QS Corporation's underground parking lot, empty and echoing with his footsteps, a foreboding mix with the desperate screams from the phone. "Leonardo, help your uncle out, huh? Help him out. 5 million, just 5 million. Help your uncle one last time, please. Just this once." The man's steps didn't falter, his expression indifferent, his eyes unmoved, chilling in their detachment. "I don't have money." The person on the other end of the phone seemed to seize a lifeline, the manic tone signaling a breakdown. "The house! You still have the house. Your uncle mortgaged it. Your dad's house is worth more than 5 million. Your uncle has it all arranged. Just sign the papers. Everything can be resolved. There'll be lots of money left over." Leo, please, your uncle really has no other way. They're forcing your uncle to his death. As the words ended, the man's steps halted, and the next moment, his thin lips parted, his cold voice echoing in the vast parking lot, like a messenger of hell delivering a proclamation. Then go ahead and die. Chapter 37. As soon as the words were out, Leonardo calmly pressed the end call button, disregarding the frantic shouting on the other end of the line, and mercilessly terminated the call, all with a touch of cruel elegance. The man returned his phone to his pocket and headed towards the elevator. Today was the day for a progress report on the collaborative project, and Jim was originally supposed to be here, but since he had a meeting at the company, Leonardo was sent alone. Using the president's private elevator, Leonardo was the only one in the enclosed space, his cold, stern face reflected in the mirrored elevator walls, his dull eyes pitch black, sending chills down one's spine. At that moment, the elevator stopped on the 15th floor, and as the doors opened, Leonardo's gaze met with someone outside. The person seemed equally surprised to see someone in the president's private elevator at this hour, but after a brief moment, he immediately offered a warm, gentlemanly smile, nodded at Leonardo, and stepped inside. Leonardo stood motionless, his expression unchanging, offering no response to the man's friendly gesture. After glancing at the floor buttons, the newcomer remained silent, indicating that both were heading to the same destination, the president's office on the top floor. In less than half a minute, the elevator reached the top floor. With a ding, both men exited the elevator simultaneously and arrived at the president's office door at the same time. Ronnie had initially thought the man was here to see Luke, as few people in the company had direct access to the president, but to his surprise, it turned out to be a coincidence. This time, Ronnie reevaluated the man beside him and then spoke first. "Hello, I'm Ronnie, the new vice president of QS Corporation. May I ask who you are?" Leonardo glanced at the hand extended towards him, a murky light flickering in his eyes before he lifted his hand to shake it, his voice cool. "Leonardo, Jim's assistant." Ronnie naturally knew who Jim referred to. The close relationship between QS Corporation and the Chi family was well known in their circles, and their collaboration was frequent. Upon hearing Jim, Ronnie immediately caught on. "So, you're Jim's assistant," Ronnie said with a smile still on his face. "Please, look after me in the future." Leonardo was aware that the position of vice president at the company had been vacant, with the previous holder being transferred to the headquarters and no new candidate found, leaving the spot open and increasing Eloise's workload. However, Eloise had performed remarkably well over this period, and the internal operations of the company didn't seem affected by the absence of a vice president. In a way, the position seemed dispensable. So Leonardo wondered why Ronnie was now stepping in as the vice president. His expression darkened slightly, but Leonardo showed no sign of his doubts, yet he scrutinized the man discreetly. Tall, with a clear-cut face, Ronnie appeared to be no older than 30, dressed in a suit that exuded a gentle and mature air. His gold-framed glasses were somewhat similar to Eloise's, and his demeanor was entirely that of a gentle, refined gentleman. He didn't seem like someone here to be a vice president. At this thought, Leonardo felt a surge of irritation and ruthlessness in his heart, but it quickly subsided. Ronnie knocked on the office door. Being the vice president of the company and an outsider from another company, in this situation, he had the duty to knock. "Come in." Eloise's voice sounded from inside, and the door was opened by Ronnie. Upon looking up, Eloise's first glance landed on Leonardo, then shifted to the man next to him before she raised her eyebrows and said, "Ronnie." "Eloise, I've heard so much about you," Ronnie said, his polite smile becoming a bit more sincere. Leonardo stood silently by the side, his gaze slightly lowered, showing no intention to speak. "Have you had lunch?" "You don't need to come so early next time. You can come a bit later," Eloise said, her voice suddenly dropping to address Leonardo. Ronnie was taken aback, realizing after a few seconds that the question wasn't for him. He glanced at Leonardo with a deeper meaning in his eyes. "I've eaten," Leonardo replied after a brief pause. You can sit on the sofa for now, Eloise said, finally turning her attention to the new vice president. Mr. Liu, I heard you graduated from MIU? Yes, so I'm also an alumnus of Eloise, Ronnie said, his eyes shining with confidence. You flatter me, Eloise said with a slight smile, forming a good first impression of Ronnie. She had returned to China after completing her undergraduate studies in the US, while Ronnie spent 6 years there and even pursued postgraduate studies. Eloise appreciated capable individuals, even if Ronnie's arrival was part of her parents' hidden agenda. Although her parents hadn't explicitly revealed their intentions, Eloise was well aware of their subtle maneuvers, likely thinking that direct approaches were ineffective and opting for a more roundabout strategy. Unfortunately, this was yet another disappointment for them. Is everything going well at the company? I'm adjusting, but there are still some operational details I'm unsure about. I wonder if Eloise has time tonight too. With a slap, Eloise closed the file in her hand, her smile still polite yet distant, as she unceremoniously refused, Sorry, I have plans tonight. If you have any questions about the company, you can ask Luke. Ronnie hadn't expected such a straightforward rejection, but, prepared for it, he didn't feel awkward and instead showed understanding. After a few more polite exchanges, Ronnie left the office, casting one last glance at Leonardo sitting on the sofa, feeling an odd sense of something unsettling. With the door closed, only Eloise and Leonardo remained in the office, and the initially serious work atmosphere now seemed somewhat amorous. Eloise looked at Leonardo still sitting motionless on the sofa, her ritualistic smile now laced with playfulness and allure. Aren't you coming over, Leonardo the assistant? Eloise said, propping her chin with one hand, her straightforwardness with Ronnie now completely gone. Leonardo's lips pressed together, and he stood up from the sofa, moving expressionlessly to Eloise's side, swiftly inserting the USB drive into the computer. This was their usual tacit understanding. Leonardo skillfully opened the presentation on the USB drive, leaning on the desk with one hand, moving the mouse deftly with the other, starting the report without waiting for Eloise to speak, his tone colder than usual. In a very intimate posture, they were barely a fist's length apart, Leonardo slightly leaning over, his head by Eloise's ear, his voice magnetic, causing Eloise to lose focus several times. His speech was quick, each word official and professional, indeed resembling a genuine report. However, Eloise wasn't fooled. Feeling the chill from Leonardo, she had an urge to laugh. But since he was seriously reporting, she didn't interrupt, patiently waiting for him to finish. 15 minutes later, the report concluded, and the office returned to its initial tranquility. Yet Leonardo remained beside Eloise, making no move to withdraw. His warm breath brushed against Eloise's ear, somewhat invasive, yet amusing to her. You know, if Luke were to report to me like this, what would be his fate? Eloise said, turning her head slightly, her crimson lips touching the side of Leonardo's face, instantly turning the tables. Leonardo's eyes darkened, but he remained silent and still, seemingly allowing the woman to do as she pleased. The crime of flirting with the boss publicly is no small matter. He would vanish from QS Corporation in half an hour. Eloise leaned in even closer to the man, her chin slightly raised, her lips pressing tightly against his ear, purposely lowering her voice, with a hint of temptation as she said, So, what should the punishment be for you? The man's pupils contracted sharply, and the next moment, a sudden soft warmth enveloped his earlobe. His body stiffened instantly, and 2 seconds later, as if scalded by something, the man abruptly straightened up, stepping back quickly, looking at Eloise, who was sitting on the chair, with a panicked expression, as if he were looking at some kind of ferocious beast. The blush spread from his earlobe to the tip of his ear, turning the entire ear a bright red, while a trace of glistening moisture clung to the man's tiny earlobe, looking somewhat sinister. Eloise was amused by the man's reaction and couldn't help but laugh softly. Hearing Eloise's laughter, Leonardo's face darkened instantly, and he couldn't help but growl, Eloise. Call me Eloise in the company, okay? Eloise said, her expression instantly becoming much more serious, yet the laughter in her eyes didn't diminish in the slightest. The man stood stiffly in place, still not recovered from the previous stimulation. "Will you dare to have foolish thoughts again?" The woman raised an eyebrow, ruthlessly exposing the man's little awkwardness just now. Having his thoughts seen through, Leonardo averted his gaze, his eyebrows unconsciously furrowed, yet the blush on his ears gradually spread towards his cheeks. "I'll come to your apartment after work." Eloise's tone was extremely natural, with a touch of undeniable authority. The man's eyes flickered, instantly understanding what the woman meant by her previous remark about having something to do in the evening. His lips pressed slightly, suppressing the slight excitement in his heart, and he responded with a faint mm. With the work report finished, the time was almost up, and there was still a schedule at the company, so Leonardo didn't linger too long in Eloise's office. Before 6 o'clock in the afternoon, having completed his work ahead of time, Leonardo left work early, drove to the supermarket, and bought many of Eloise's favorite dishes. The car was bought by himself. At the time, after selling the house, Leonardo bought a simple family sedan immediately. It wasn't luxurious, but it was very practical, simply for the convenience of going to the supermarket to buy groceries after work. He got his driver's license in college and even did part-time work in that field. After graduating from university, he didn't drive anymore. Then he met Eloise, and every time they went out, he sat in the passenger seat, as if there was never an opportunity for him to drive. After leaving the supermarket, Leonardo seemed to remember something else and drove to a nearby department store, buying an expensive bottle of makeup remover before hurrying back to the apartment. However, when he stepped out of the elevator with a large bag of things, he heard a commotion from afar. His expressionless face suddenly turned extremely cold, and the next moment, the man's footsteps stopped halfway. A few seconds later, he turned and slipped into a corner, concealing himself in the shadows. The quiet corridor echoed with Logan's plea for mercy, with a hint of flattery, like a final desperate struggle. "Big bosses. This is where my nephew lives, I've inquired. He gets off work at 6, and he should be back soon. The house is registered under his name. I'll talk to him in a moment. He will definitely sign. I've had it appraised. That house is worth $8 million. After the debt is settled, shouldn't the remaining money be?" Before Logan's words finished, the man in front of him suddenly spat, his speech filled with vulgar words, filled with hostility. "Bullshit. You still want the remaining money? Did you think you wouldn't give interest on the $5 million you owe me? You still want the remaining money? Dream on." Leonardo slightly turned his head, looking coldly at the group of people standing in front of his apartment, indifferent to the point of being terrifying. A trace of irony flashed in his eyes, his gaze landing on the man surrounded in the center, feeling nothing but disgust, unable to raise any other emotions. He didn't expect that his uncle would really go all out, even finding his address, calling him in the afternoon, and showing up with people in the evening. Leonardo knew his uncle had a gambling addiction, and a large part of his parents' inheritance was squandered by him. Ever since he came of age, he hadn't helped him out less, but that family was like insatiable bloodsuckers, sticking to you tightly, wanting to squeeze out all the blood from your body, not even sparing the last drop. He didn't know why he was so foolish back then, indulging their insatiable behavior again and again. Now thinking about it, he didn't need any so-called relatives, he just needed Eloise alone. His eyes surged with almost crazy dark waves. Leonardo glanced at the time displayed on his phone screen and couldn't help but feel a trace of impatience. It was 6:20 now. According to Eloise's usual schedule, she would arrive at the apartment in 10 minutes. But he absolutely wouldn't allow these filthy people to appear in front of Eloise. A few seconds later, the man opened the message interface, typing expressionlessly. "Leonardo, I forgot to buy chili sauce." Within a minute, the other party replied, "Which kind?" Fingers moving swiftly on the screen, Leonardo found a picture online and sent it to Eloise. Leonardo, image. Eloise, got it. At this moment, the group of people at the door seemed to have lost their patience, directly pushing Logan against the wall and giving him a hard slap. "You fucking playing with me? How long has it been? Dragging your feet? Don't you want your hands anymore?" Logan was completely dumbfounded by this slap. The fear of facing death made him disregard his current plight, hurriedly taking out his phone from his pocket, desperately and frantically saying as he pulled at his torn lips, "I'll call him now. I'll call him now. He's my own nephew. He won't ignore me. He can't possibly ignore me." Hearing the words "own nephew," Leonardo sneered, a bloodthirsty light flashing in his eyes, half of his face hidden in the shadows, chilling to the bone. The next moment, the phone in his hand vibrated as expected, his dear uncle calling. Leonardo waited for half a minute before pressing the answer button at a moderate pace. He could have hung up directly, but he didn't have the time to play with them. Besides, listening to someone's lament seemed not to be an uninteresting thing. Almost as soon as the call connected, Logan's voice came through from the other end, echoing in the corridor, entering his ears simultaneously. Leo, are you off work? Where are you now? Uncle and friends have come to your apartment to see you. It's like this, Leo. As long as you help Uncle this one more time, Uncle definitely won't bother you again. Uncle is your family after all. When you were young, Uncle even held you. Uncle knows you certainly won't stand by and watch me die, right? The plea for mercy, so humble it was extreme, yet it made Leonardo couldn't help but frown. Annoying. The next moment, the man's lips parted slightly, his indifferent voice more like the whisper of a demon. "Is there someone next to you?" Yes. There's someone. They're right beside me. Leo, please come quickly. If you don't come, they'll chop off Uncle's hand. Give the phone to them." Leonardo said. Almost immediately, Logan hurriedly handed the phone to the person next to him, his eyes bursting with ecstatic relief from the brink of death. Leonardo watched as the man took the phone and brought it to his ear. The next moment, his tone again like stagnant water, cold to the point of startling. "Firstly, within 5 minutes, leave my doorstep, or else the surveillance footage in the corridor will be on the police computer tomorrow. Secondly, within a week, I will file a lawsuit with the court to regain the right to live in that house. Thirdly, whether you chop his hand or take his life, it's none of my business." One by one, clearly reasoned. After speaking, Leonardo hung up directly, not giving the other party any room for negotiation. The disconnection sound echoed in the quiet corridor. The man holding the phone instantly darkened his face, looking up and seeing the camera in the distance, then couldn't help but curse. The next moment, the man grabbed the collar of Logan, giving him another furious slap, gritting his teeth and saying, "Fuck, are you fucking playing with me?" At this moment, Logan seemed to finally realize that Leonardo really intended to stand idly by. After 2 slaps, Logan's face was already swollen beyond recognition, his mind also gradually blurred, falling into despair. Seeing Logan's dying look, the man suddenly remembered what Leonardo had just said, then hurriedly dragged Logan towards the elevator, not daring to delay for even a moment. 2 minutes later, the corridor was quiet again, and the man also walked out from the shadows. The rhythmic footsteps echoed in the corridor, one after another, matching the 10 minutes ago's desperate cries of Logan, like a tragic symphony with tragic colors. Melodious and pleasant. 20 minutes later, Eloise arrived at the apartment, holding a brand new bottle of chili sauce, changing her shoes at the entrance. In the kitchen, the faucet was wide open. "I've bought it." The woman, who was changing her shoes, didn't notice the abnormality in the kitchen. She didn't notice that at this moment, the man was standing expressionlessly in front of the sink, pouring the chili sauce into it entirely. The sound was mixed with the water flow, and at the moment the woman stood up, the man threw the empty bottle into the trash can, as if nothing had happened, and gently said, "Thank you for your hard work."